stop in the middle because I think you should. Can we edit this part out?
Yeah, definitely. We have to.
US 台湾 Watch 美国台湾观测站，台美关系下一站，新闻加料，
评论加辣，
欢迎收听观测站底加啦。
欢迎来到本集的观测站底加啦，这集又是一个重要的番外篇。我们没有要来聊本周的新闻，但我们要来讨论的是从上周以来就是最重要的一个事情，就是香港的国安法。那我们今天邀请到两位来宾，那因为我接下来的访问呢都会用英文开始进行，所以我在这边提醒一下我们 podcast 的观众，如果你们需要中文字幕的话，就麻烦请你们移驾到 YouTube 那边，那我们的节目连结可以在下方的介绍栏目看到，因为我们接下来全部都要用英文开始来对话了。Okay, so I'm going to switch myself into English mode. All right. So today we are very honored to invite the founder of the HKDC, Samuel Chu, and the member of the HKDC, Jean, to our podcast. She will also help me to interview Samuel. So thank you, Jean.
No problem. So, Samuel Chu founded the first and only Hong Konger lobbying organization in DC, HKDC. You could see it as a Hong Konger's equivalent of PAPA. As a managing director of HKDC, he oversees the pro-democracy activist group in the U.S. and arranges advocacy training. And we'll say hi to everybody.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Samuel, for coming.
Could you do a quick intro and talk about the achievement of HKDC and your impression of Taiwan?
Yeah, so as I think you have already mentioned, HKDC is the first and the only advocacy organization for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, in DC. Even though we're not the first to come to DC to lobby, there's been many over the last 30-some years who have walked the halls of Congress. There have been leaders all the way going back to Martin Lee and Anson Chen, who were here in the 80s and 90s. To the most recent, to Joshua and Nathan and others who have been here. What is different is that HKDC really is the first ever attempt and successful creation of an organization that is led by Hong Kongers, who speaks for Hong Kong, and it's also the center, the hub that helps to coordinate all the different voices and parties in Hong Kong to be able to make the best case possible in the US. Mm-hmm. And I would be remiss to not begin by saying that really the only reason why we were able to create this permanent long-term presence in DC is because of the commitment and resiliency of the protester in Hong Kong. Because if they had just gone home after the 2 million people march in last June and July, we wouldn't have this window to really consolidate and to leverage and harness the international support and the US support that we now see. And it's really because of their resiliency that we were able to then translate that into a US political base that now is having daily and weekly visits and conversations with members of Congress, with the administrations. We played a critical role in the negotiation, the drafting, and the passage, and the final signature from the president of the Hong Kong Human Rights Democracy Act that passed last year. That was a historic signature. I've worked in U.S. politics for a long time. It was the fastest I've ever seen a bill introduced and pass both houses and then actually enacted into law. And I think that is a demonstration, a reflection of the kind of political power and muscles that we were able to build in a very short time. In addition to that, we actually have passed a number of other bills. We passed a bill that specifically called the Protect Hong Kong Act that limited the export of crowd control, tear gas, riot gears from the US to Hong Kong, and a number of other extremely important policies. And I think that is, again, we're building on the work of the last 3 decades, but it's really a consolidation of all the hard fought wins and a recognition that just like the Taiwanese community has FAPA, who's constantly and permanently in DC, HKDC is the manifestation of those long-term commitment. In addition, I think one more thing I want to mention is that we, in March, right before actually the pandemic hit, we were able to host the first ever HKDC Policy Conference and Day on the Hill
Wow.
that welcomed
Okay.
almost 75 people from across the US to actually come together for training, for briefing together, and then actually to go on the Hill together to advocate
Wow.
for support for Hong Kong. And so those are really important. And we, in between those moments when we launched in September and the March conference, we hosted almost 10 different delegations of individuals and groups from Hong Kong who came to make the case, either in congressional hearing or into individual members of Congress. And we were able to stage those. And even now, during the pandemic, we have this week staged 2 congressional briefings online that were attended by more than 200 people live. So those are some of the things that we're committed to and continue to do.
Wow, I'm not a Hong Konger, but I still want to say thank you for you. Like those bills we see on the news, behind that was HKDC, and that's just amazing. And like I think it's time for Jane to say hi to our audience.
Yeah, I should probably introduce myself before everything. But hi, I'm Jean. It's a great honor to be invited to the show as a second host. To talk a little bit about my involvement with Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. I'm the editor of 2 Facebook pages, Hong Kong Dossier, which is a regional Hong Kong supporting group, and Translate HK, which is a page dedicated to inform English readers about what's going on in Hong Kong. So feel free
Go
to
follow the pages.
feel free to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. On behalf of my crew, I'd like to thank Taiwanese people for their unconditional support and care. Yes, days get gloomy sometimes, but a gentle pat on the shoulder from you all is what keeps us going.
Aw, thank you. I'm about to cry. I think like most of the Taiwanese people are feeling what I'm feeling right now. Like looking at what is happening in Hong Kong, we really want to help. And we also want to know how to help. But before we address on that, I think we need to know more about what is happening in Hong Kong. So let's jump into our first question, shall we? Let's do the quick recap on the controversial legislation of the security law. Simi, could you tell us a little bit about the bill and why and how is it controversial?
Yeah. So I think many have been hearing in the news about this particular proposal. On May 21st, a few weeks ago, the National People's Congress announced that they are going to propose and impose a new national security law directly in Hong Kong, bypassing the Hong Kong legislature and really in violation of both the Hong Kong Basic Law and Chinese Constitution itself, where they are directly imposing this national security measure, which essentially is a law that lays out the banning what they call subversion, sedition, treason, and terrorism, which we have seen and we know how it plays out in mainland China is that it essentially gives a blanket ban to all dissent and any kind of protest and everything that has been protecting Hong Kong, especially in the last year of the kind of organizing that you see. There are a few things that are important to know about this. A national security law are not new to Hong Kong. Back in 2003, there was a proposal under Hong Kong legislation to propose a national security law, what is called Article 23. When that was announced by the Hong Kong chief executive and the legislature in Hong Kong, there was 500,000 people from Hong Kong that immediately went to the street. And because of that protest movement, that law was shelved. And then your listeners probably remember just a year ago, a little over a year ago, the Hong Kong legislature and chief executive announced an extradition law. That was the impetus to this past year of protests that led to 1 million people and then 2 million people that went to the street. That protest also beat back the law that was proposed in Hong Kong, and they had to shelve it. So this really is a blatant attempt and also an acknowledgement that the Chinese government realized that they actually can't control and suppress the kind of dissent that is happening in Hong Kong. So they are now directly bypassing Hong Kong legislature to propose and impose this law that would then effectively ban all the dissent and protest movement in Hong Kong now. And I think that is significant not only because of the silencing of the dissent and the curbing of freedom, but that it's actually fundamentally deconstructing the one country, two system promise to Hong Kong.
So please correct me if I'm wrong. So this law basically would allow the CCP government to extend their power in Hong Kong. So it's basically declaring the end of the Hong Kong's autonomy and freedom.
Yeah, and I think that is what is expected, even though I think that there's a lot of propaganda about how this is only targeting a small number of people. I think one of the Chinese officials today said that it's only about the 0.01% of troublemaker that they're targeting. That is absolutely not the case, as evident by all the actions by Communist China in mainland China. The specific measure, obviously we don't know what the final law is going to be. It's only been approved as a drafting process. We will see the final product hopefully in June or in August. Is that they are proposing that they would actually establish specific offices physically in Hong Kong of the Chinese security bureaus to enforce this national security law. So that raises actually all kinds of questions, because it is not just a legal invasion, it is actually the physical invasion of Hong Kong autonomy.
So what is the reason behind CCP's decision right now, and what is the message that it's trying to send?
Yeah, because I think we want to know why now.
Yeah.
Like they talked about the movement last year, and thousands of people went on street in 2003, and why now they are still doing the same thing.
Yeah. In some way, again, I think like I said earlier, it's a reflection of how resilient the protests in Hong Kong has been. It is not a surprise. Again, they started trying to crack down on dissent in Hong Kong and sort of the freedom that is enjoyed by Hong Kong, even really early on, right after the handover in 1997. But what has happened now is that I think China has come to recognize that they are not going to simply wait out the protester in Hong Kong. They're not going to be able to simply just say that, like, we can, let the Hong Kong government try to deal with this. And I think that they feel a need to assert complete and total control, because the longer that this lingers, not only does it galvanize Hong Kongers, to galvanize international support, but this is going to continue to seep into China. And I think that they are beginning to feel the threat of what this might mean if they let Hong Kong continue to respawn and descend this way. How does that play, and what people are going to think all across mainland China?
But I mean, like, now coronavirus, COVID-19 is taking life around the world, and why they are pushing that hard at this moment? Does this pandemic has any relevant to their action right now?
I think that this threat that they feel to, controlling within started, before the pandemic. I think that what the pandemic has added to the urgency of the fact that I think the world, not just Hong Kong now, the world has come to see in plain sight the kind of internal authoritarian tactic that is used, especially through this handling of the pandemic, that has exposed them to even more criticism. And I think that might have in some way shaped also the acceleration of this. But this was always in the works, and I think this was unfolding already even before the pandemic.
So they have always wanted to declare to the world that this is our turf. Even without a pandemic, they were still probably are going to pass this law. Then I have to come to this question. If the CCP government passed a law and enforced it, what's the impact on Hong Kong, and in terms of its citizens, its foreign investment, and its international status?
Well, I think that you're already seeing that. I think that over the past year, there's already been a lot of, shifts in attitude about the fact that I think Hong Kong knows, and nobody is being, buying the propaganda. They know that this will look like what it looks like in China, is that any kind of small, even a minor voice of dissent and minor act of dissent by individuals and by groups will lead to very, very direct, heavy-handed punishment. And right now, we already see the Hong Kong government and Hong Kong police have arrested close to 9,000 protesters since last June. And they're still working through the prosecutions and then sentencing them to jail for simply participating in their right to protest. And I think that you're going to expect a lot more swift and illegal arrests, detainment, potentially even, as we see in mainland China, being sent to labor camp, torture, and other kind and former crackdown. And I think that that is already a sense that is felt deeply in Hong Kong, even before this law has been formalized. And I think that what you saw last year with the extradition bill, if business communities are afraid of being extradited to China, imagine how scared they're going to be when they can just actually get arrested directly in Hong Kong. They don't even have to be extradited anymore with this law if it goes into place. And that is going to completely destroy Hong Kong's strategic value as both economic, political, civic, and really even just as a place of free information. We see in this pandemic of how critical it is that Hong Kong serves as a base to expose and transfer of information from mainland China. And I think that China sees that as a threat as well. So I think that it's going to have a profound, and it already is having a profound effect.
Okay, I think that everything just makes sense for me because yesterday I saw a pro-China guy who was talking about this issue. And he basically is saying that in the long run, the security law can actually make Hong Kong a better place for foreign investment. And then it doesn't make sense, but here's his explanation. He says that the reason why Hong Kong's economy went into a recession is because of the protest. And he believed that once the authority enforced the law, the security law, either by wiping out those pro-democracy camps or force them to flee abroad, the stability will restore in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong will go back to normal. But as what you were saying, that is not going to happen because Hong Kong's outstanding economic performance was based on the freedom. It's based on its reputation of rule of law. And people can feel safe when they are in the city. And now with the security law being enforced or being passed, these freedom and reputation will gone. So Hong Kong will no longer be attractive to foreign company. It also limits the citizens' freedom. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that you pointed out a very important point. I think for very long, and probably way too long, the world, and particularly US and others, have bought into this idea, this myth that somehow if the economic works and the business side works, then it's going to be okay because China will somehow become much more open and free because of free trade and because of market and free market. And that, I think, sort of the pie in the sky, sort of the idea for a very long time. And what you have seen, and I think that that's why the argument that other person that you saw might have worked even 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, or maybe even a year ago. People would buy into this idea that somehow, look, China can make this work because they are a free market. Well, it turns out they're not. And I think that right now, today's announcement by the White House, you saw, I think, a clear sign that we are now finally living in reality. And the reality is that China was never on this path of free and democratic evolution into this place. That's why I think that argument no longer holds any water.
Mm-hmm. I think that their Washington bubble just no longer exists, and they have to face the reality. They are now facing it. They are taking the consequences of their previous decisions. Then I want to talk about what happened on Wednesday. I think Jing knows that Wednesday is a big day for us. There are so many things happen on Wednesday, and we are all overwhelmed by the news. So let me go a quick recap on what happened on Wednesday. 5 things happened. First, Secretary Pompeo has notified the US Congress that the Trump administration will no longer regard Hong Kong as an autonomous from China. And then Pompeo spoke to the UK Foreign Secretary to discuss the concern over Beijing's effort to impose the security law on Hong Kong. And the third news is US mission to the UN called for the UN Security Council to hold a meeting on Hong Kong. And then there's also something going on the Canada side. Huawei's Meng Wanzhou lost her fight against extradition. And the last one, but not the least, the House passes the Uyghur Human Rights Bill and has sent it to the Trump's desk.
That's all happened in one. That's all that happened on Wednesday.
Yeah, this all happened on
Actually, there's so much more, but these are the five like major things that happen. If I have to say everything, I think it's gonna be like
yeah, we'll have
1 hour episode.
we'll have to make 3 episodes just for using.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask, with the territory losing its special status under U.S. law and threatening its status as a financial center, what would possibly affect Hong Kong's economy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a few things I want to make clear is that the announcement from the State Department is not a shock to anybody. Even though it feels like it's a shock, I think that if you ask anybody in Hong Kong, they would tell you that this has been the case for a long time. And that's partly what we have also said, and HKDC has spent many, many hours and days in the last 9 months making the case clearly, the nuance that if you don't live and recognize this reality that China has breached this one country, two system and the high degree of autonomy that was promised, then you're not really negotiating for real in this foreign policy fight that we're in. And you're not actually giving Hong Kongers the kind of real backup that is needed, the leverage that is needed. So I think that's an important thing to remember. And the second thing I want to just say and clarify to your point, Gene, that so Wednesday's certifications, today's announcement by President Trump, they are really the beginning of the step. And I think that there's still, again, as most politics and policies are, it is a process, it's incremental, and there's always sort of fluency around it, is that the president actually didn't give any specific details as to if it's a wholesale, in part, partial, temporary. What he says is that we're going to take a look and take steps now to examine which part of those special privileges that is accorded to Hong Kong under the 92 Hong Kong Policy Act that we can actually use as leverage against the PRC and the Hong Kong government. And I think that that's really important because, again, we're on a path that is somewhat of a, we're all lose. The world lose, China lose, US lose, and Hong Kong, most of all, lose at this final destination of the path that we're on. But we have a lot at stakes, and there's still some time to put the bricks. And I think it's up to the CCP and the PRC to be able to say to President Xi Jinping that, okay, we can still negotiate and back off. Because I think that what we encourage and what HKDC would continue to push for the administration and in Congress is that we have to be surgical and strategic about how to use this special status and privileges and how to maximize the pain and the cost to the PRC and Hong Kong government officials that are complicit in this crackdown, while still maintaining room so that the immediate blunt of the pain is not borne by the general public in Hong Kong.
And I also want to ask a question. Jeannie was asking about the economic impact to Hong Kong, and I want to follow on with the House overwhelmingly voted to approve the Uyghur Human Rights Act and the possible extradition for the Mo Wanzhou case. What is the message that U.S. wanted to send, and then how are these events relevant to Hong Kong? Does this Security Act affect the U.S. attitude toward these issues? These are connected?
Well, we certainly think that they're connected, and we certainly want them to be connected. And I think that is actually one of the things that, going back to, if I may, like why it's so important to have HKDC, is because there's limitation at the end of the day of how much U.S. would do for purely the interests of Hong Kong people. At the end of the day, what you have is that you must align that interest. And I think the same thing in Taiwan, same thing for, in Xinjiang and Tibet, is that you got to align that interest to U.S. national political interests. And so part of what our job and we have been able to accomplish, and I'll be honest, we benefited from a lot of external factors, is that we now see an alignment, long-term and short-term, of how the U.S. and other countries calling out the behavior and essentially their bullying and of not just Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang, of everybody, of American companies, of other governments. That has now become I would say, a seismic shift globally even compared to a year ago or 6 months ago. And I think that is very significant. And that's why I think you're seeing, and I think that these connected dots, I was talking to some of our friends who have been advocating for the Uyghurs human rights bill for a while. They actually got introduced before the Hong Kong bill. They were stuck in Congress for a long time. I think in some way we like to think that we played a small part in kind of loosening the gridlock in Congress to be able to move forward. But we also recognize that, unfortunately, and we know we're privileged, that the kind of human rights and abuses that our Muslim and Uyghurs friends have experienced are in a lot of ways much worse, much more intense, much more broad scale, and for much longer time. It is our responsibility as Hong Kongers who has the world stage and attention to put the spotlight not only on ourselves, but on our Uyghurs brothers and sisters, on our friends in Taiwan and other places, because that's our responsibility. And I think that they are all connected.
So I'd like to ask, how would this play out for the upcoming 2020 U.S. presidential election?
I think it's important for people to recognize this. Ultimately, decisions are going to be made based on U.S. interests.
Yeah, definitely.
And so what I think we are looking at now is that we have done a tremendous job up to this point and still going strong of making Hong Kong a bipartisan cause. We have been able to get congressional support. We have gotten a Republican administration to be very firm. Sometimes they wobble from time to time. I would say that this president has not always been upfront and forthright about his support, but we get them there. And I think that that's part of the dynamic of politics that I think people outside of the US need to understand, is that I believe that we are building real political power because we should be able to influence and hold accountable no matter who it is that is in office. So when it comes November, when the election is over, if there's a change in party, we need to have that staying power to be able to say that our political base and organizing and relationship is strong enough that we will be able to influence whatever the administration, may it be a new, different administration, the same way that we did this one. And I think that it's important for people to understand that the permanent long-term loyalty of political parties in the US is not tied to one or the other. That there's not just one party that, permanently are friends with Taiwan or Hong Kong, or one is more sympathetic to China or the other way around. It is dictated and shaped by US interests, but more importantly, how US people, like folks at UKCDC, make that case to US politicians.
I think that's important because, when people are looking at US response and what the US government has done in support of Hong Kong, we shouldn't overlook the variable of the upcoming election in November. We need to know that the first priority for Trump now is to be re-elected. So this election will definitely affect his decision. And if putting a sanction on China can help, Trump will probably do it. And then here comes my next question. So Samuel, do you think China cares about a sanction? The reason why I'm asking this question is because last week, my two other fellows, Mushroom and Jerry, and we had a discussion on it. And honestly, we don't think China cares. And is that what you think so too?
I think that's always been the questions of at what point does it become painful enough for China to essentially evolve and change? Here's why I don't have a crystal ball. I don't actually know all the answers. And I would love to know if you know what that pain threshold for the Communist Party is. But I think here's what we do see. With or without our control, the world economy is going into a worldwide recessions and depression because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think that you're already seeing the pain that exacting on China. And this is on top of the trade war that has been a big point of contentions and fight and tension. Then on top of, no matter what they tell you in Hong Kong and in China, Hong Kong is a critical economic finance entry point and exit point, not just for companies, for individuals. And I think this is why, even though the US is not saying immediately that we're going to now, cut off all these privileges and revoke all the status, but even the signaling of it will now have impact to how companies and individuals make decisions over the course of the next few months. And I think that is one lever that I think is important to pull. The other is that, this requires Xi Jinping to hold on extremely tight control within the Communist Party. And as you do targeted sanctions to people who begin to feel some of the pain, you begin to see some of the cracks within the inner circle of the Communist Party. I think that's another lever that could potentially be leveraged. And I think that I really do believe that this connecting the dots, this kind of emerging connections of not just Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, but the whole Southeast Asia and, the African countries that now owes a huge amount of debt to China that they cannot repay, and countries like the US who find it either politically convenient or rightfully so based on facts, blaming China for the pandemic and the impact, has ratcheted up, I think, a global connection of connecting the dots all around the world around what pressure and what maximum pressure can look like for China. And I do think that we're now in a world, people I think have fond of talking about how that we're now returning to nationalism and closing borders. Our world is connected, and China is going to have to feel the pain and have to deal with these global dynamics. They're not going to be able to forever insulate because they have made a decision to be connected to the Western world.
So we know that it's going to cause pain to China, but we don't know if that pain can change their attitude. But we know that probably that will shake up a little bit of the Communist Party, and that will have some ripple effect. We don't know how they're gonna go, but we hope that's gonna change what we're seeing right now. Right.
I mean, I think that, to borrow in some ways sort of what are the tactics of people remember we're coming up on the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It was clear it happened in one big place. It happened in a large scale. It happened in the darkness of the night, and it happened within 24 hours. That's rare. There's been hundreds and thousands of repeat of that in much smaller scale over time. And in some way, I see it as that we have to attack this. This is a strategy of sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And so we're going to keep nagging at it and say that, here's a Hong Kong thing that happened. Here's the Uyghur sanction for the companies that are involved in that. Here's this piece, here's that piece. And all of those is going to add up. And I think that that's really what we've been trying to do, is to make sure that we are, any opportunity and every opportunity we can, we exact a price and make a cut into the sort of shield and guard that they have.
Well, let's jump back into more of the regional question. What would the passing of this national security law impact the 2020 Hong Kong legislative election?
I think the Communist Party has not forgotten of the butt kicking that they got in November last year. Even though, yes, the election format is different, there's a built-in sort of rigged system of only half of the seats are actually openly elected on the Legislative Council. But believe me, they know and they remember. And that, I think, is part of this calculation, that if they don't try to assert more control now, they might find themselves, with a partially pro-democratic majority in the LegCo after the September. And I think that they know that, and I think that they are calculating that that's not an acceptable outcome. And so I think that what you're going to see, they're going to probably attempt to do some of the things that they did, even though in the district council election, they technically only disqualify one candidate, Joshua Wong, who filed to run. But I think you're going to see some of that. You're going to see some more crackdown specifically on candidates, and are they anti-China? Are they anti-party? Are they actually running afoul of national security and then disqualifying them, or even disqualifying them after the election? But I think at the same time, what has happened is that the protests led to the landslide victory for the Pandem in November. And I think that this kind of tactic of, we're going to do this no matter what because we have total and complete control over you, it's going to lead to another backlash, and I think a building of energy around the pan-democratic candidates. And I think that you will see a fairly, I think, robust campaign that will get Beijing and pro-Beijing forces are going to be sweating it out to say, like, why did we, set this up so that you're essentially energizing the voter base to come out and vote against us.
Yeah, I believe we saw that with the Chinese presidential election. I found it.
Okay. Before we jump into the question about Taiwan, let me ask a question, which I believe probably lots of people will have the same question as I do. Do you expect the UK to provide any kind of support to Hong Kong? The reason why I'm asking this question because I do think the UK has a say on this matter. UK is the co-signer of the 1997 Joint Declaration. So they have the responsibility to ensure the lifestyle of Hong Kong, right?
I think that if you ask most people in Hong Kong, they would say that they've been fairly disappointed. Even though this week they finally made a joint statement with the US and with the EU, and then they made an announcement that they could potentially consider giving an extended visa to Hong Kongers who hold the British National Overseas Passport. I welcome them to the party, probably about 20 years late to the party that they should have been leading and hosting, which is to ensuring that they hold up their part of the bargain and responsibility to the joint agreement. And I think that, in my mind, part of the reason why we ended up here, and I mean, some would even argue, and I'm one of those people who would even argue that they capitulated to China even before the handover. There were real energy and consensus in Hong Kong that election should happen, free election should happen even prior to 97. And the British basically said that because the Chinese threatened and pressured them to not allow for it, they dropped the whole idea, which is what led to then this promise of universal suffrage after the handover. So yes, I think that there's a lot of responsibility and that is laid at the feet of the Brits, and I welcome their late arrival to this fight, and never too late as long as you show up. But I hope that they will catch up and really kind of exert their sense of not just moral obligations to Hong Kong, but it is their treaty. They are, as you said, the co-signer. It's their legal and political obligation and global obligation to lead this fight.
I hope Boris Johnson do listen to our podcast.
Tune in to US Taiwan Watch.
Hi, Boris.
We'll
Hi,
send a
Boris.
link. We'll make sure we post it. We'll tweet it. We'll Instagram it. Everywhere. We'll hunt him down.
Okay, and we hope they can help, but we are not expecting them to do too much. But how about Taiwan? At least we are facing the same threat. Sorry, I shouldn't say the same threat because different degree of threat, but I mean we're facing the same enemy. I don't know, should I use that word? But as a Hong Konger, what do you expect from Taiwanese government to do?
Well, so recently we have been talking and have connected with the Causeway Bay bookseller from Hong Kong who was abducted and kidnapped in mainland China and has since moved to Taiwan and reopened his bookshop in
President
Taiwan.
Tsai visited him
Yeah.
yesterday, I think.
And in some way, I think that the complex, mixed feeling that he has of both having to essentially live in exile and yet having the lifeline and to be able to go to Taiwan, I think represents some of the anxiety and fear that many people have. I'm not proposing that Taiwan takes all of Hong Kong. There are a lot of us in Hong Kong. There are almost 8 million Hong Kongers. But even just that symbolic act, I think, gives Hong Kongers a kind of reassurance that there is, at the worst case scenario, as a backup, there's outlets to not just Taiwan, but hopefully to the UK and others.
Mhm.
But I also think that in some way we see Taiwan as being a little bit of a big brother. As you said, the degree of threat might be different, but Taiwan is an example of a free and democratic place that gives a kind of hope that I think is important for Hong Kongers to be able to see. And I think that the outspoken and the willingness to come out strong and direct and immediate fashion to speak on behalf of Hong Kong's interests and its autonomy and freedom is an important piece of this overall puzzle that we're looking at. And and that's not to say we recognize, particularly for Hong Kongers, we know that Taiwan has its own struggle and challenges on the global stage. And I think it has been the case. The struggle in Hong Kong has made Hong Kongers understand better, I think, the experience of Taiwan and what the Taiwanese people are fighting for. And I think that only strengthens both of us in the long run.
I hope President Tsai would also listen to our podcast. I'll send the
Hi,
link
President
to.
Tsai.
Hi, President Tsai.
Is there any president that does not listen to your podcasts?
Not really.
Okay.
Oh, maybe Xi Jinping. That's the only one I can think of. So,
Yeah.
Okay, so we know that there's lots of limitation on a government agency. So here comes that I think is the most important question I want to ask, which will I think it will also explain why you're here. Why Taiwanese people should care and help Hong Kong? And for this question, I also want to ask Jane.
I think you should ask Jean first. I want to hear what
Okay.
Jean has to say.
Okay, then. Yeah,
Yeah,
Jane, you should tell everybody that actually you're a Taiwanese.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm actually Taiwanese. I'm like Taiwanese American, so I guess my character is kind of special in this movement as a Taiwanese American helping out Hong Kongers. So, 17 years ago, Taiwan was barred from World Health Organization, and now with COVID-19, despite Taiwan's leading coronavirus response, we're still isolated from this global public health network. And I think it's extremely crucial for us to make friends for Taiwan, all of us. I mean, none of us could foresee the future. Therefore, I always keep in mind that maybe, and just maybe, I'll be lucky enough to know more people, and maybe some of them, one of them, one day will turn out to be a strong ally of Taiwan. That is my first reason for why people should care about this movement, especially Taiwanese people. And second of all is I hope I won't be witnessing it in my lifetime, but if one day Taiwan's in dire need of help, I hope what I learned from this movement, or what I learned for the past 300 something days, and the new friends I made will provide Taiwan vital needs she needs. And then I think by participating in this movement, a lot of you could learn so much from Hong Kongers. Like, they have been inspirational, they have been good friends of mine. Like, I could go on forever to talk about the things they did for me. And so it has been like a very rewarding experience for me to work alongside with them. And no matter where you are, it could be Europe, Africa, Pacific Islands, you're not the only Taiwanese person that's helping Hong Kong out. Like, you're never alone in this fight. So shout out to all our Taiwanese American brothers and sisters who have been voicing and supporting this movement. The bullying in workplace and on campus would not stop us. I'm also extremely proud of Taiwanese people from home pushing Thai administration to do more for Hong Kong. And then I think that is something Jasmine would know more.
Yeah, I can talk about what Taiwan now have done. But Sammy, do you want to say something about this question or want to respond to what Jenny has said?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Jean said. I always agree with everything that Jean says. So that's always a good thing. A few thoughts. I think when you ask why it is Taiwanese people should care, I think that one is we are, for better or worse, and sometimes for both, connected. Our fate is pretty connected at this point. People always kind of knew that, maybe kind of in the back of their mind. I don't think that they necessarily feel it in their own personal, visceral way. until in the past year, and maybe even the
Mhm.
past couple years since the 2014 protests. I think that is a deeper understanding of the struggle and the aspiration of each other through this fight and this struggle and solidarity is invaluable and essential if we're both to prevail. And I think that speaks to the friendship, aspect that Gene talked about. Is it's not just the abstract. It's me getting to know you, and me getting to know Gene, and Gene getting to know the other Hong Kongers. Which is why, when we did the conference in March, it was so important. Is because that's how you build political relationships and power.
Mhm.
Is that much more personal connection that I think really transform, I think, both movement and people. The other thing is that I think is Hong Kong and the movement and Hong Kongers have captured the imaginations of the world, which then I referred to earlier. I see it as an obligation to share that, to make sure that it's not just Hong Kongers fighting for a small part of Hong Kong, but it's about us maximizing and sharing. And I think that is something that Taiwanese people should care about. And you guys have been at this for longer, both in Taiwan and here in the US. But right now, we are glad and happy to share the spotlight as much as we can and to learn together and to be able to work on these things together. That's why, as I said earlier, I will never claim, credit for having moved other legislation like the Uyghur Human Rights. But I like to think that in talking about that bill together with our interests of Hong Kong, in making sure that that bill is mentioned every time we go into a congressional office, that is essential for the strategy moving forward. The third part I would say is that, and this is maybe a little bit more to our interest as well to yours, is there are more Taiwanese American than there are U.S. Hong
Yeah.
Kongers.
Which is true.
So we would appreciate and have appreciated the support, but we need you. And as Gene said,
Join us.
since you have come to our aid in our moment of need, I can speak for myself and for HKDC, is that we'll be there in your moment of need. And I think that that's an important
Yeah.
thing to remember.
I think the reason why we're friends is because we have the same value, and we're standing together to secure that value, and that is actually the universal value. So I think the whole universe it's like a Marvel movie, but like the international community should also like stand with us, and yeah, that's the reason why all of the presidents should listen to our podcast.
Yeah, we're always short-handed. That like button. So message us. We'll take helpers. So I don't need to write stuff till like 3 a.m.
I just got to make sure that my mom listens to this podcast. So
Yeah,
that's
Oh.
And on a personal note, actually, I probably should have said this early on, is that I actually, part of my heritage, my mother is Taiwanese. And so
Oh.
both of my parents actually went to school in Taiwan. And so there is, again, I think this is partly what this whole movement building and relationship building is about, is discovering that, we're not one-dimensional beings. We have these experience, heritage, legacies, values, and beliefs that come from who we are, that comes alive because we get into fights like this together.
I also want to add a question before we enter our last questions. We know there's a lot of Hong Kongers, they are now applying for the citizenship in Taiwan because they are afraid that they might be arrested or put in jail just because they are pursuing their human rights. And Samuel, you're now living in the state, but do you have the same concern? Do you worried about that once you go back to Hong Kong, you probably won't be able to come back?
I think that's been a question that I think has become more real even in the last week for many. And I think I am fairly typical of many US Hong Kongers or any Hong Kongers overseas. My immediate families are all there. Both of my parents and then my brother and his families are in Hong Kong. And so I think the concern is real. And perhaps this is a little bit unique to my experience. This has been the reality of my family for decades and for most of my lifetimes. My father was an organizer that helped support the Tiananmen Square protest movement back in '89.
Wow.
when the massacre happened, my father actually built the Underground Railroad that smuggled the dissident who escaped Tiananmen Square
Whoa.
from China to Hong Kong, and then helped to get them visas and status to Western countries, including the U.S. And so this is not a new reality for us. Even more recently, my father was actually one of the co-founder of the Occupy Central umbrella movement back in 2014. And so just last year, a little over a year ago, I was there in Hong Kong in the courtroom when my dad, along with others, 8 others, were convicted of their role in organizing the 2014 protests and sentenced to for essentially exercising their free speech and right to protest. And so this has been a lived reality, and we, with some mixed feelings, and I was talking to some congressional offices even this morning, is that we're not going to give up. And I think that that is evident now more than ever, is that there's no giving up in this fight. Even for those of us who are outside of Hong Kong, we see this as our fight, and we see this as a fight that we're not going to run away from. And yet, we also have lived through those realities of Tiananmen Square and what might be forthcoming in Hong Kong. And so we are working actively. We are going to be actually next week introducing a series of bills and policies proposal in the US, also target immigration pathways and potentially even refugee status for parts of the population in Hong Kong that will be most susceptible to the persecutions. So in a way, again, I think I sympathize with the Hong Kong bookseller who's in Taiwan now. There's always this mixed emotions of grateful of the hope that there is still potentially at the end an escape, but also a sadness that we do not want and ever want that to be the outcome for Hong Kong or for Taiwan.
Let me ask the last question. So with this sad fact, does HKDC have any future planning regarding safeguarding the Hong Kong youngster to receive education potentially in the US?
So I think that there are a number of things that we're really going to be pushing for. I think to your point, we are looking at specific protections, and we are, I think, looking at some targeted specific populations. One is what you mentioned, particularly youngsters who have participated in a protest, who have been arrested and prosecuted.
Oh, okay.
And I think that you're also seeing that in this particular climate where somehow an expansion of just students visas in general for Hong Kong students. And I would just add to this is that the added benefit of it's not just about giving them like an overseas education because, America, everyone who wants to go to America. The other point of it is giving them an opportunity to develop into the kind of free, public, democratic leaders that Hong Kong is going to need long term. In some way, the Hong Kong government in China has done a great job at essentially radicalizing and baptizing a whole generation of activists. But that's not enough. Just because they've been baptized by tear gas and police brutality and have even gone to jail, there needs to be this development and education, not so much about, book smart and studying, a particular subject, but the democratic civic education that is absolutely fundamental so that they can actually go back to Hong Kong and lead, to continue to lead as they have in this protest. So I think that's another thing. And then I think we are looking at specific ways where how do we coordinate, what is the target group that the Taiwanese government can help most? If the British can take the BNO and up to the 3 million that could potentially have residential rights, then what are the other pockets and groups that we can target in the US? So that is something that, again, next week, we're going to be announcing and getting to work publicly on a lot of these legislation on the part of the US. And, just like what I described as far as why HKDC and FAPA and others are so important, is that just like the protest and the fight for democracy and sort of change in China and in Hong Kong and Taiwan is never ending, the process of fighting for the interest and future of Hong Kong in the US is continuous and never sleeps. Because it is our job to continue to align US interests to the evolving interests and situation in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And it is our job to continue to build relationships with U.S. lawmakers and administrations, no matter who is in office and who's there. So that work continue, and that's why I think having a presence like HKDC in DC and in the US is so crucial, because I think for the last 30 years, part of the shortcoming of the movement in Hong Kong is that we get a lot of attention whenever there's a march with 500,000 people or 1,000,000 people, or there's a protest that takes over the street for 80 days or 90 days. But in between, those 5 years between 2014 and 2019 were lost because we couldn't harness and maintain the momentum that we had built. And that is critical going forward. And that's why I would hope that we continue to be able to do this work. We welcome the support of the Taiwanese communities. And I think that the Taiwanese people is uniquely positioned to understand the importance of a group and the work that we do as HKDC.
I really want to thank Samuel. Like, when I was preparing for this episode, I thought we're gonna have a really sad ending, but actually I think you gave us hope, and I really appreciate that. So I wanted to encourage everybody who are listening to our podcast that don't lose hope, even in the most difficult circumstances. So I'm calling for everyone to leave a thank you note to Samuel and Jane below at our comment section, and to share this episode to your friends and tell them why we Taiwanese people, we should care and what is happening now in Hong Kong. So at the end of the episode, I want to teach Samuel to say a sentence in Taiwanese. And I know that would be way too easy to teach you to speak in Chinese, so we're like doing Taiwanese. So the sentence in English is, "Thank you, our friend in Taiwan, for your support and encouragement."
Okay,
so
wait.
Okay,
That is a very, very long sentence.
You can do it. We can do it.
Okay.
I'll just say that I hope you're mentally prepared for this, because it's actually a very long sentence.
Yeah, it is. So, okay.
I didn't know that this is going to be the hardest part of this whole thing.
All right. So how to say this is, actually, my Taiwanese is not good.
See, that would make me more nervous.
Okay, so I'll pretend to be a good teacher. Okay, so it's 感謝台灣的朋友，和阮的支持加鼓勵。Wait, it's so. Let me do it again. It was so bad. Wait, I have to practice a bit. 感謝台灣
Okay, can you
的
stop
朋
in
友
the middle, because I think you should do the first part and then stop so that I can like process.
Actually, I please, if
Maybe
anyone
Gene
is
can say it.
say it, because my accent probably will be wrong. Maybe Gene, you can try it.
感謝台灣的朋友，和阮的支持加鼓勵。
She say this so much better than I do. You know, before the episode, Mushroom is our queen of Taiwanese. She taught me how to say it, but I'm a really bad student. So maybe Gene, you will do it, and I'll learn it from you.
One more time, Gene. One more time.
Alright, one more time. Alright, so 感謝台灣的朋友，和阮的支持加鼓勵。
感謝台灣的朋友，給阮的支持和鼓勵。
You're basically saying Chinese.
This is not working.
It is not. You're not learning.
Sammy,
How
you can
about
try
this?
it one.
This is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop embarrassing myself and HKDC and Hong Kong. I'm going to say, 感謝台灣的朋友.
Okay.
Stop there.
Okay, that works. Okay. Okay, then now your turn to teach me in 广东话.
You're teaching us how to say 光复香港时代革命.
Oh.
Yes.
So funny story. I was in Hong Kong at the end of last year, and I was going to a restaurant. And as many of you know, there's now this whole divide between sort of yellow ribbon and supportive, restaurants. And I was just at a rally. I spoke at the rally that was thanking the U.S. for passing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And then I snuck out and had to go get some food. And I went to this restaurant that was a yellow shop. And then, like, sort of spontaneously, periodically, the whole restaurant would just go 光復香港時代革命 and then they just go back and forth and like they sort of like chant the slogan. Like one side of the restaurant would go 光復香港 and then the other side would go 時代革命. So I am very familiar, obviously, with this place. But here's my Cantonese is actually not 100% either. So in Cantonese, it will be 光復香港時代革命.
光復香港
香港係
香港
時代革命
時代革命光復香港時代革命
Perfect, you did it.
Okay.
Yeah, that was so much
Okay.
easier actually.
Yeah. You only need to say 感謝大灣感謝大灣嘅朋友 Okay, I hope our podcast listener also learn these 功夫
光復香港時代革命
功夫香港時代革命 I'm really bad, I'm sorry, but I hope our audience also like learn it. And I still want to say thanks to Samuel and Jane to our podcast. It's really our honor, and thank you for giving us this hope that we will definitely stand with Hong Kong in this fight for democracy. So thank you guys for like coming to our podcast, and thank you for our listeners. And I think I'll see you in next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.